Book 1, The Family, Section 6 of The Professor's House by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Book 1, The Family, Section 6. The professor happened to come home earlier than usual one bright October afternoon. He left the walk and cut across the turf, intending to enter by the open French window, but he paused a moment outside to admire the scene within. The drawing-room was full of autumn flowers, dahlias and wild asters and goldenrod. The red-gold sunlight lay in bright puddles on the thick blue carpet, made hazy areoles about the stuffed blue chairs. There was in the room, as he looked through the window, a rich, intense effect of autumn, something that presented October much more sharply and sweetly to him than the colored maples and the aster-bordered paths by which he had come home. It struck him that the seasons sometimes gain by being brought into the house, just as they gain by being brought into painting and into poetry. The hand, fastidious and bold, which selected and placed, it was that which made the difference. In nature there is no selection. In a corner beside the steaming brass tea-kettle sat Lillian and Louis, a little lacquer table between them, bending, it seemed, over a casket of jewels. Lillian held up lovingly in her fingers a green gold necklace, evidently an old one, without stones. "Of course emeralds would be beautiful, Louis, but they seem a little out of scale, to belong to a different scheme of life than any you and Rosamond can live here. You aren't, after all, outrageously rich. When would you wear them?" "At home, dearest, with me, at our own dining table at Outland. I like the idea of their being out of scale. I've never given her any jewels. I've waited all this time to give her these. To me, her name spells emeralds." Mrs. St. Peter smiled, easily persuaded. "You'll never be able to keep them. You'll show them to her." "Oh, no, I won't. They are to stay at the jeweler's in Chicago until we all go down for the birthday party. That's another secret we have to keep. We have such lots of them." He bent over her hand and kissed it with warmth. St. Peter swung in over the window rail. "That is always the cue for the husband to enter, isn't it? What's this about Chicago, Louis?" He sat down, and Marcellus brought him some tea, lingering beside his chair. "It must be a secret from Rosie, but you see it happens that the date of your lecture engagement at the University of Chicago is coincident with her birthday, so I have planned that we shall all go down together, and among other diversions we shall attend your lectures." The professor's eyebrows rose. "Busman's holiday for the ladies, I should say. But not for me. Remember, I wasn't in your classes, like Scott and Outland. I'd give a good deal if I had the chance," Louis said somewhat plaintively. "So you must make it up to me." "Come if you wish. Lectures seem to me a rather grim treat, Louis." "Not to me. With a wink of encouragement, I'll go on to Boston with you next winter when you give the Lowell lectures." "Would you really? Next year's a long way off." "Now I must get clean. I've been working in my other house garden, and I'm scarcely fit to have tea with a beautiful lady and a smartly dressed gentleman. What am I to do about that garden in the end, Lillian? Destroy it? Or leave it to the mercy of the next tenants?" As he went upstairs, he turned at the bend of the staircase and looked back at them, again bending over their little box. Mrs. St. Peter was wearing the white silk crepe that had been the most successful of her summer dresses, and an orchid velvet ribbon about her shining hair. She wouldn't have made herself look quite so well if Louis hadn't been coming, he reflected. Or was it that he wouldn't have noticed it if Louis hadn't been there? A man long accustomed to admire his wife in general seldom pauses to admire her in a particular gown or attitude, unless his attention is directed to her by the appreciative gaze of another man. Lillian's coquetry with her sons-in-law amused him. He hadn't foreseen it, and he found it rather the most piquant and interesting thing about having married daughters. It had begun with Scott. The younger sister was married before the elder. St. Peter had thought that Scott McGregor was the sort of fellow Lillian always found tiresome. But no, within a few weeks after Kathleen's marriage, arch and confidential relations began to be evident between them. Even now, when Louis was so much in the foreground, and Scott was touchy and jealous, Lillian was very tactful and patient with him. With Louis, Lillian seemed to be launching into a new career, and Gottfried began to think that he understood his own wife very little. He would have said that she would feel about Louis just as he did, would have cultivated him as a stranger in the town, because he was so unusual and exotic, but without in the least wishing to adopt anyone so foreign into the family circle. She had always been fastidious to an unreasonable degree about small niceties of deportment. She could never forgive poor Tom Outland for the angle at which he sometimes held a cigar in his mouth, or for the fact that he never learned to eat salad with ease. At the dinner table, if Tom, forgetting himself in talk, sometimes dropped back into railroad lunch-counter ways and pushed his plate away from him when he had finished a course, Lillian's face would become positively cruel in its contempt. Irregularities of that sort put her all on edge. But Louis could hurry audibly through his soup, or kiss her resoundingly on the cheek at a faculty reception, and she seemed to like it. Yes, with her sons-in-law she had begun the game of being a woman all over again. She dressed for them, planned for them, schemed in their interests. She had begun to entertain more than for years past. The new house made a plausible pretext, and to use her influence and charm in the little anxious social world of Hamilton. She was intensely interested in the success and happiness of these two young men, lived in their careers as she had once done in his. It was splendid, St. Peter told himself. She wasn't going to have to face a stretch of boredom between being a young woman and being a young grandmother. She was less intelligent and more sensible than he had thought her. When Gottfried came downstairs ready for dinner, Louis was gone. He walked up to the chair where his wife was reading and took her hand. "My dear," he said quite delicately, "I wish you could keep Louis from letting his name go up for the arts and letters. It's not safe yet. He's not been here long enough. They're a fussy little bunch, and he ought to wait until they know him better." "You mean someone will blackball him? Do you really think so? But the country club—" "Yes, Lillian, the country club is a big affair and needs money. The arts and letters is a little group of fellows and, as I said, fussy." "Scott belongs," said Mrs. St. Peter rebelliously. "Did he tell you?" "No, he didn't, and I shall not tell you who did. But if you're tactful, you can save Louis's feelings." Mrs. St. Peter closed her book without glancing down at it. A new interest shone in her eyes and made them look quite through and beyond her husband. "I must see what I can do with Scott," she murmured. St. Peter turned away to hide a smile. An old student of his, a friend who belonged to the Outland period, had told him laughingly that he was sure Scott would blackball Marcellus if his name ever came to the vote. "You know Scott is a kid in some things," the friend had said. "He's a little sore at Marcellus and says a secret ballot is the only way he can ever get him where it wouldn't hurt Mrs. St. Peter." While the professor was eating his soup, he studied his wife's face in the candlelight. It had changed so much since he found her laughing with Louis, and especially since he had dropped the hint about the arts and letters. It had become, he thought, too hard for the orchid velvet in her hair. Her upper lip had grown longer and stiffened as it always did when she encountered opposition. "Well," he reflected, "it will be interesting to see what she can do with Scott. That will make rather a test case." End of Book 1, The Family, Section 6.